The world after abolition did not look like freedom, it looked like adjustment. On paper, slavery had ended, but on the plantations, power did not disappear. It rearranged itself. The same land remained in the same hands. The same great houses still stood above the fields. The same men who had once commanded bodies now learned to command circumstances. This was the moment Charles Montfort and William Hargreaves had been waiting for, not with impatience but with calculation. Charles Montfort had always believed that survival depended on records, unlike Ashcombe, who relied on systems, or Blackthorne, who relied on fear. Montfort relied on documentation. His estates in British Guiana were famous not for visible cruelty, but for numbers, birth rates, death rates, productivity curves, injury reports. Everything was written down, categorized, cross-checked. To outside observers, his plantations appeared almost humane, especially when compared to the horrors emerging elsewhere. That reputation was not accidental, it was engineered. When abolition came, Montfort was ready. He presented himself as a reformer, a man ahead of his time, someone who understood that slavery was no longer sustainable and that free labor could be managed just as efficiently. Contracts replaced chains, wages replaced ownership, but the land remained his, and with land came leverage. Formerly enslaved people found themselves tied to the same estates through debt, lack of alternatives, and legal structures designed to appear fair while functioning otherwise. Montfort's genius lay in invisibility. Punishments became administrative, control became bureaucratic. A worker who resisted could be dismissed, evicted, or reported for breach of contract. Hunger replaced the whip. Homelessness replaced confinement. The suffering was quieter, easier to deny, and far harder to challenge. To Britain, Montfort was proof that abolition worked. To the labourers, little had truly changed. William Hargreaves, by contrast, had never cared about appearances. His plantations in Demerara had been isolated even before abolition, deliberately cut off from scrutiny. He discouraged visitors, limited correspondence, and maintained strict internal control. Where others feared exposure, Hargreaves minimized the chance of being seen at all. Abolition threatened this isolation, not because it ended slavery, but because it invited oversight. Hargreaves responded by withdrawing further. He exploited loopholes, delayed implementation, and used local influence to stall enforcement. Freedom on his estates arrived slowly, unevenly, often only in name. Workers who attempted to leave found themselves blocked by geography, debt, or intimidation. Hargreaves believed time was his ally. If he could outwait reform, the empire's attention would drift elsewhere. Both men understood something Ashcombe and Blackthorne had not, that the end of slavery was not the end of domination, only the end of one method. Power, when threatened, adapts. It becomes subtle. It learns new language. Montfort spoke the language of progress. Hargreaves spoke the language of isolation. Both sought the same outcome: control without consequence. For the formerly enslaved, this new era was deeply confusing. Freedom was promised, but boundaries remained. Choices expanded slightly, but risks multiplied. To resist now was to risk starvation rather than punishment, displacement rather than violence. The struggle did not end. It changed form. And because it changed form, it became harder to name. In Britain, abolition was celebrated as moral victory. Few wanted to look closely at what followed. Montfort's reports were welcomed. Hargreaves' silence was tolerated. The empire congratulated itself while allowing old hierarchies to persist under new labels. History moved on, but not forward for everyone. This was the second act of the plantation story, the one rarely told. Not the age of chains, but the age of contracts. Not open brutality, but managed inequality. Montfort and Hargreaves did not fall immediately, as Ashcombe and Blackthorne had. They endured, and in enduring they ensured that the legacy of plantation slavery would survive abolition itself. This is where Part 2 truly begins, not with freedom achieved, but with power refined. Charles Montfort believed that history rewarded those who could explain themselves convincingly. Where others relied on fear or tradition, he relied on language. His plantations in British Guiana became showcases of what he called transition. Slavery had ended, but Montfort insisted that discipline, order, and productivity was still necessary. He spoke often of responsibility, claiming that sudden freedom would lead to chaos. This argument was repeated so frequently that it began to sound like truth, especially to officials who wanted reassurance more than justice. On paper, Montford's estates were models of reform. Labor contracts were signed, wages assigned, work hours defined. There were no chains, no public punishments, no visible brutality. Inspectors who visited saw fields in operation and workers moving in familiar rhythms. What they did not see were the invisible boundaries that controlled every choice. Land surrounding the plantations was owned or influenced by Montford. Leaving meant homelessness. Refusing work meant hunger. Complaints meant blacklisting. Freedom existed, but only within limits he designed. The contracts themselves were traps. Wages were technically paid, but often delayed or reduced through deductions for housing, tools, and alleged misconduct. Illness was treated as absence. Absence became debt. Debt became obligation. Workers who attempted to leave before contracts ended found themselves pursued legally, accused of breach, and returned under threat of imprisonment. The law that had ended slavery now enforced dependency. Montford kept meticulous records, confident that documentation was protection. Every injury, every dispute, every dismissal was written down in careful language. Suffering was translated into administrative terms. A man collapsing from exhaustion became a case of non-compliance. A woman refusing work after childbirth became a productivity issue. By changing the vocabulary, Montford believed he had changed the reality. And for a time, it worked. But records also preserve contradictions. Over time, patterns emerged that Montford could not fully hide. Mortality rates remained high. Workers cycled through contracts without accumulating savings. Entire families remained tied to the same estates years after abolition. These details, buried in reports, began to attract attention from reformers who were less interested in appearances and more interested in outcomes. Whispers grew into inquiries. Letters were written. Questions were asked about why freedom seemed so limited in practice. Montford responded with confidence, producing more documents, more explanations, more rationalizations. He insisted that progress was gradual, that expectations were unrealistic, that order must be maintained. Each defense sounded reasonable in isolation. Together, they began to reveal a system struggling to justify itself. Among the workers, disillusionment hardened into awareness. Freedom, they realized, was being managed rather than denied. Resistance adapted accordingly. Instead of defiance, there was calculation. Contracts were studied. Loopholes were sought. Collective pressure replaced individual rebellion. Small refusals multiplied. The system slowed, not from chaos but from negotiation. Montford found this deeply unsettling. His authority depended on compliance with rules that appeared fair. When those rules were questioned, his moral foundation weakened. He could discipline bodies no longer. He could only discipline paperwork, and paperwork, unlike fear, requires belief to function. By the time scrutiny intensified, Montford understood that his greatest strength had become his vulnerability. The records meant to protect him now told a story he could not fully control. The language of reform he had mastered was being turned against him. He had survived abolition by adapting its surface. He was now facing a challenge to its substance. The plantation did not erupt into violence. It eroded, quietly, methodically. And in that erosion, Montford began to glimpse the same truth that had undone those before him. Power that depends on explanation is always one question away from collapse. William Hargreaves never trusted reform, and he trusted attention even less. While others adapted by changing language or systems, Hargreaves believed the safest form of power was distance. His plantations in Demerara were remote by design, surrounded by difficult terrain and managed through layers of intermediaries. Long before abolition, he had learned that visibility invited interference. Now, with the empire watching more closely, he doubled down on isolation as a strategy of survival. After slavery was officially abolished, Hargreaves delayed implementation wherever possible. Contracts were introduced slowly, often verbally rather than in writing, making them easier to manipulate. Workers were told that little had changed except terminology. They still labored the same fields, lived in the same quarters, and followed the same rules. Freedom was described as a responsibility they were not yet ready for. Many believed him, not because his arguments were convincing, but because alternatives were unreachable. Geography worked in his favor. Leaving the plantation meant navigating land controlled by his associates or entering areas with no work, no shelter, and no protection. Hargreaves understood that freedom without mobility was symbolic at best. He used debt, intimidation, and misinformation to keep people dependent. Wages, when paid, were minimal and inconsistent. Any attempt to challenge conditions was met with threats of dismissal or expulsion, consequences that could be fatal in an unforgiving environment. Unlike Montfort, Hargreaves kept few records. He believed documentation created vulnerability. Instructions were given orally, punishments were informal, authority flowed through trusted overseers whose loyalty was ensured through reward and fear. This lack of written evidence allowed abuses to continue without immediate consequence. It also meant that when questions were raised, there was little to point to and much to deny. For a time, this worked. Inspectors found little because there was little to see. Reports from the region were vague, inconsistent, easy to dismiss. Hargreaves presented himself as cooperative but overwhelmed by logistics. He blamed distance, labor shortages, and climate for delays. The Empire, eager to believe that abolition was succeeding, accepted these explanations more readily than it should have. On the plantations, however, resentment deepened. The promise of freedom felt increasingly hollow. People began to realize that isolation was not accidental, but enforced. Information was restricted. Letters were intercepted. Movement was monitored. This awareness changed behavior. Resistance became patient and collective. Workers shared knowledge quietly, prepared to act when opportunity appeared. That opportunity appeared not through rebellion, but through exposure. As Mumford's records attracted scrutiny, reformers began looking elsewhere for similar patterns. Rumors about Demerara reached Britain through missionaries and traders. The very isolation Hargreaves relied upon now raised suspicion. Questions were asked about why progress there lagged so far behind other regions. Hargreaves dismissed these concerns until officials arrived unannounced. Their presence disrupted the careful balance he had maintained. Without records to justify his practices, he relied on authority alone. But authority, once challenged, loses its certainty. Testimonies from workers contradicted his claims. The absence of documentation became evidence rather than protection. The system Hargreaves had built began to unravel not through force but through visibility. Isolation could delay scrutiny, but it could not prevent it forever. When the empire finally looked closely, it found not chaos, but deliberate stagnation. Freedom had been postponed, not by circumstance but by design. Hargreaves did not fall dramatically. He resisted, delayed, appealed. But each action drew more attention. His plantations became symbols not of transition, but of obstruction. The quiet control he had perfected now worked against him. Silence no longer concealed power. It exposed it. By the time consequences arrived, the structure that had sustained him was already weakened. He had outlasted slavery, but not its aftermath. And in trying to remain unseen, he ensured that when he was finally noticed, there would be nowhere left to hide. By the time scrutiny reached its peak, the stories of all four men began to converge into a single narrative. Sir Reginald Ashcombe, Edward Blackthorne, Charles Montfort, and William Hargreaves had ruled in different ways, with different temperaments and methods, but they were now facing the same force. It was not rebellion, and it was not violence. It was accountability. Slow, imperfect, and deeply uncomfortable, but unavoidable. Ashcombe watched this reckoning from a distance, convinced that separation would spare him its full weight. He had secured compensation, protected his wealth, and reshaped his public image. Yet as investigations widened, his name surfaced repeatedly in testimonies and reports. Formerly enslaved people described systems of fear so precise they seemed intentional. Historians and reformers began connecting the dots between his reputation for order and the suffering that order required. Ashcombe realized too late that distance did not erase responsibility, it only delayed recognition. Blackthorne faced judgment more directly. His cruelty had been too visible, too well remembered to be softened by time. Witnesses spoke without hesitation. Former overseers, sensing the shift in power, distanced themselves from him, sometimes turning against him to protect their own futures. The fear that had once surrounded Blackthorne evaporated, replaced by something far worse for a man like him. disdain. His authority collapsed not because he lost land immediately, but because he lost legitimacy. Without fear to sustain it, his dominance meant nothing. Montfort attempted to defend himself with the same tools that had carried him through abolition. He produced documents, contracts, statistics. He argued that his plantations represented progress, that suffering was exaggerated, that reform took time. But now those records were being read differently. Patterns of dependency were highlighted. Mortality figures were questioned. Wages were compared against living costs. The language that once protected him now exposed him. His system, designed to appear humane, was revealed as carefully managed exploitation. Hargreaves resisted longest. He appealed decisions, challenged authority, blamed geography and misunderstanding. But isolation who cost him allies. When pressure intensified, there were few willing to defend him. Testimonies from workers, once dismissed as unreliable, were now taken seriously. The absence of records, once his shield, became proof of concealment. His plantations were no longer ignored. They were cited as examples of deliberate obstruction. What united the downfall of these men was not punishment alone, but loss of narrative control. For decades they had defined the story. They decided what was visible, what was hidden, what mattered, and what did not. Now others were telling it. Formerly enslaved peoples spoke in their own words. Reformers reframed events. History began to look less like order and more like coercion, less like progress and more like endurance. The empire itself struggled with this reflection. Abolition had been declared a moral triumph, but these cases complicated that story. They revealed how easily old power survived under new names, how justice, delayed and uneven, often favored those who had already benefited most. The reckoning was real, but incomplete. Some men lost influence. Some lost reputation. Few lost everything. On the plantations, the impact was mixed. Oversight increased. Conditions improved in places. In others, hardship simply shifted shape. Freedom existed, but it was constrained by poverty, land ownership, and inherited inequality. The end of these men's dominance did not mean the end of suffering. It meant the end of certainty. The rules were changing, but the game remained difficult. As attention moved on and reform slowed, one truth remained clear. The power these four men had wielded was never natural. It had been constructed, enforced, and defended by systems that could be challenged once they were named. Their fall, uneven as it was, proved something essential. Control depends on silence, and silence, once broken, cannot be restored. This section marks the moment when the past stopped belonging to those who shaped it and began belonging to those who survived it. The judgment was not perfect, but it was irreversible, and with it, the plantation era entered its final, uneasy phase. When the attention finally moved on and the inquiries faded from headlines, what remained was not closure, but residue. The plantations continued to exist, though altered in form and language. The great houses still stood. The fields were still worked. Labor still flowed upward toward profit. The men who had once ruled absolutely were diminished, but the structures they had shaped proved far more resilient. This was the quiet aftermath, the part history often compresses into a sentence and then forgets. So Reginald Ashcombe lived out his later years in relative comfort. His wealth survived, diversified and protected by distance from its origins. Socially, he became quieter, more cautious, his name no longer spoken with admiration, but rarely with open condemnation either. He was not celebrated, but neither was he truly punished. His story faded into respectability, which for him was a kind of victory, yet everything he had built his identity upon was gone. The certainty, the control, the unquestioned authority. He remained wealthy, but no longer powerful in the way that had once defined him. Edward Blackthorne's end was lonelier. Stripped of influence and avoided by those who once feared him, he became a reminder of a past few wished to defend openly. His lands changed hands over time. His name became shorthand for excess rather than success. Without fear to sustain his presence, he diminished rapidly. What remained of him was not legacy, but reputation, and reputation, once fixed, cannot be negotiated. Charles Montfort adapted longer than the others. Even after scrutiny, his systems lingered, embedded in contracts and local practices that outlived him. But adaptation has limits. As generations passed, his methods became outdated, challenged by workers who understood the law better than those who had written it for control. Montfort did not collapse dramatically. He was outgrown. His influence eroded slowly, dissolved by the very bureaucracy he had trusted to protect him. William Hargreaves disappeared most completely. Isolation, once his strength, became his undoing. When his estates were finally forced into compliance, there was little left to defend. No allies, no narrative, no justification that could survive examination. His name faded not because it was forgiven, but because it was no longer useful to remember. Oblivion replaced authority. For the people who had lived and labored under all four men, the end of their dominance was not an ending at all. Freedom remained complicated, incomplete, and often conditional. Land ownership stayed concentrated. Opportunities were limited. The past shaped the present in ways that were difficult to escape. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The plantation was no longer untouchable. Power was no longer invisible. The story could be told. That, more than any law or reform, became the lasting change. The ability to speak, to record, to challenge. Silence, once enforced, had been broken, and even when systems adapted, even when inequality persisted, that silence never fully returned. The legacy of plantation slavery did not end with abolition, but it did lose its disguise. Part 2 closes here, not with resolution, but with clarity. 4 men rose by mastering domination. All 4 fell when domination could no longer hide behind legality, distance, or language. Their stories are not warnings from a distant past. They are reminders of how power behaves when it believes itself permanent. History did not erase them. It exposed them, and exposed them, and exposure, once begun, does not end quietly. This story ends where certainty ends, not with triumph and not with complete justice, but with understanding. The British plantation system did not collapse because 4 men fell. Those men fell because the system that protected them could no longer remain unquestioned. Slavery ended in law, but its logic survived in habits, contracts, and inequalities that reshaped themselves rather than disappear. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this history. Sir Reginald Ashcombe, Edward Blackthorne, Charles Montfort, and William Hargreaves ruled in different ways, yet each believed that control could be made permanent. One hid behind order, another behind fear, a third behind paperwork, and the last behind isolation. All were wrong. Power that depends on silence, distance, or compliance cannot survive exposure. Once examined, it weakens. Once named, it loses its authority. For those who endured plantation life, abolition was not an ending, but a threshold. Freedom arrived unevenly and imperfectly, shaped by the same structures that had once enforced bondage. Yet something irreversible occurred. The plantation ceased to be invisible. Its violence, once normalized, became historical fact rather than accepted practice. The story shifted from the voices of owners to the experiences of the controlled. This contusion is not meant to close the past neatly. It is meant to remind us that systems of domination rarely announce themselves as cruelty. They present themselves as order, necessity, or progress. They survive by adapting their language and disguising their outcomes. The British plantation after abolition was proof of that adaptation. It also became proof that adaptation has limits. What remains is responsibility, to remember without myth, to examine without comfort, to understand that history is not distant when its consequences still shape the present. The end of these 4 men was not the end of injustice, but it was the end of unquestioned rule, and once rule is questioned, it can never fully return.